Hello everyone, and welcome to our monthly Support Coordinator webinar. My name is Vicky Gray, and on behalf of Endeavour Foundation, I am your host for today's webinar. During our session, we'll be delving into how to manage risk in support coordination, and we'll be hearing from Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. As we were meeting online with attendees logging on all across Australia, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognise the importance of the lands we call home. If you would like to honour the custodians from where you're logging in from, please feel free to mention the traditional name in the chat. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gubbi Gubbi people, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting from today. In the spirit of reconciliation, Endeavour Foundation acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Now, I'd like to quickly go over some housekeeping before we proceed. Please note your microphones and cameras are automatically off for the duration of the webinar. However, we encourage you to engage with other support coordinators about the topic within the chat. For any questions you would like Mary to address, please include those in the Q&A. There'll be a survey circulated at the end of the webinar if you would like to provide feedback on the session or suggest possible future topics. If you've been here before, you'll know that we give away a free coaching session with Support Coordination Academy. The winner will be drawn at the end of this session. In the chat box, you'll find a link to our privacy policy. Please reach out if you have any questions regarding this. Now, before we introduce you to our speakers today, I strongly encourage everyone to subscribe to our bi-weekly Care Connect newsletter. It's an invaluable resource tailored specifically for support coordinators. This newsletter not only features our latest information for NDIS and support coordinator articles, but also highlights work and community opportunities for your clients. Plus, you'll stay informed on our latest home vacancies if you're looking to enhance your support efforts and stay informed. So please take a moment to sign up using the link in the chat. Thanks. As mentioned earlier, during this webinar, we'll be diving into how to manage risk in support coordination. Our presenter today is Mary Ingerton from Support Coordination Academy. Shortly, Mary will be diving into identifying various types of risk, understanding your responsibilities in risk management, and techniques for demonstrating how risks have been addressed. Before handing you over to Mary, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Brett Thomas. Brett is a risk advisor in our legal and governance team here at Endeavour Foundation. Brett's diverse career spans industries like events, environment, manufacturing and disabilities. A common thread throughout his time has been mitigating risk through best practices and learning from mistakes through the philosophy of continuous improvement. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start with mentioning that working in risk in the disability sector has its own specific challenges, where the focus on client care in regards to areas such as living arrangements, entertainment, physical and mental well-being, medication and other support needs are the main focus from an operational risk mitigation point of view. Looking at risk at the enterprise level is about pulling out the scope and looking for risks that can affect our organisational objectives. Managing risk at this level has a multifaceted structure. At the top, we look at risks that can affect an organisation's viability to keep the doors open. Then we have risks that impact our strategic objectives and risks that will impact our divisional objectives. The main reason why I found a role in risk at Endeavour Foundation appealing was for the opportunity to work with the risk management standard that's applied here and also the electronic risk management system. The functionality of the management system is something that I find really exciting to work with in general, as these systems bring all the data together and help senior leaders make informed decisions. In saying that, undertaking a risk assessment is an important incremental part of the process, and when funneled into a centralised system, it helps it become more than just a safeguard against risk. It adds to the actual decision-making process. Risk management should be a systematic, structured approach in determining an accurate risk profile so that senior leaders can understand where risks are coming from or could come from to strengthen their decision-making. Following the best practices laid out in ISO 31000, our policy essentially outlines the 8 guiding principles that define what a risk management should be, which is integrated with all organisational processes, structured and comprehensive, customised for the organisation's purpose, inclusive to all stakeholders, dynamic to changes. It also incorporates best available options. It considers the human and cultural factors, and it's a continual improvement initiative. The context of a risk is extremely important as it helps with knowing exactly what the circumstances are around a risk. To clarify, an enterprise risk will affect a strategic objective, and an operational risk will affect a process such as lifting a client. Internal risks are those that we can control, and external risks are something we need to bend and flex with because it isn't within our control. A good example of an internal risk in the disability sector is duplication of process, and a good example of an external risk is change of government or policy. Our risk management procedure is where the detail for managing risk is documented, and while the scope of my role relates to those of a higher level risk, the process is virtually the same for all of our risk assessments. Building a risk register is paramount in understanding the organisation's risk profile and is required to demonstrate risk management practices for any certification or NDIS audits. In organisations with a high risk maturity, all employees are trained to look for anything that might impact on their performance, and helping staff understand how to do this should be embedded in an organisation's culture to help build on that risk awareness. Putting a score on a risk by using a customised organisational risk matrix with consequence categories will help expose where the controls are needed, and if a risk cannot be mitigated to a safe level, it should be escalated for a treatment plan. So guided by our risk matrix framework, Endeavour's board has clearly outlined our risk appetite statement, which helps risk assessors to know where they should be mitigating risk according to the organisation's set risk tolerance level. For clarity, areas such as WHS or client care have a low tolerance for risk. However, asset management might have a little bit more flexibility if opportunities arise. Our electronic risk management system centralises all of our risk data, and once the risks have been assessed and controls put in place, we can see a managed risk score to produce an accurate report. This helps our senior leaders make informed decisions. This also improves targeting problem areas where the gap hasn't been closed. The system also sets the review period, where high risks will be reviewed more frequently than low risks, and the system notifications will be sent out accordingly. This keeps risk owners in the loop on when and where they need to take action. I'll finish by saying that measuring risk is a fundamental part of risk management, but learning from mistakes and experiences and building upon these is where risk management is truly demonstrated. I'd now like to hand over the reins to Mary to broaden our understanding of risk management in support coordination.
Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you very much for coming along today. We've got quite a big crew today, which is just amazing. Right, so I'm Mary, I'm the Managing Director for Support Coordination Academy. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to manage risk and support coordination. So thank you to Brett. Brett really was really focusing on an organisational perspective around risk. So what I really want to focus on, which is amazing, and there's some real correlations across the both roles. What I really want to talk about today is risk in relation to the support coordinator role. So practically, what does that look like? Types and levels of risks, and what are some of the strategies that you can use? Okay, so let's get started. At the end, we'll hopefully have an opportunity to answer some questions. So feel free to put those in the Q&A and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's make a start. If any of you have actually been to my webinars before, I tend to start with the context and then I kind of drill down into strategies. So first of all, let's have a look at, well, what is risk? So risk is a simple way of defining risk in terms of the probability of harm occurring. So it's about something bad happening. It's about something that could have happened now, but it's also about thinking about if this happened, what would be the impact of that? So risk occurs when there is uncertainty of the effects or implications of an event happening. So in respect to something that we value, so risk often comes from our own perspective. So we might have some really strong values around, deterioration in someone's health, or someone being able to remain safe within their home, or it could be about someone's well-being or their property. So the effects or implications of an event happening are viewed in terms of a negative or undesirable consequence. So when we're thinking about risk, we're often thinking about if that risk happened, what would be the impact? What's a negative or undesirable consequence that could happen? And also when we assess risk, we assess the likelihood that the risk will occur, and if the risk does occur, the most likely outcome based on the information or the evidence that we have at that point in time. So risk is always about, well, what do we know now? Where is the information we can get it from? How can we make that assessment based on what we have? Okay, so that's kind of a bit about risk, and I'm really going to talk to you about risk within the support coordinator role. So support coordinators are an intermediary, which you will likely know, between the NDIS and the participant. So it means that the support coordinator kind of sits within that role between the NDIS. The NDIS generally have limited contact with the participant unless things change. So as the intermediary and the person that has that regular contact with that person, our role is to really update the NDIS about what's happening with that person. So we also have that professional responsibility around our safeguarding role. So that safeguarding role, part of that safeguarding role, is having the skills to assess, manage, and report on risk that places the participant at risk of harm. And risk of harm around what we're looking at is support coordinator role within the NDIS context. So support coordinators assess risk within the context of the NDIS for participants that they support. They use risk assessments to evidence how barriers to accessing the support they need to live their best life impacts on and creates risk for that participant. Once we've identified those barriers, the impact and the risk, the next step is then to develop mitigation strategies to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk occurring, and detail action plans which really says, well, these are the actions I'm going to take. This is how I've supported this person. These are the other people that are within that person's support network, so the stakeholder group, who are also taking ownership of and managing some of that risk. And I'll talk to you a bit more about that later on. Okay, so assessing risk is also about identifying the impact of current risk of harm to a participant. So it might be something that's currently happening, or it could be about the risk of future harm if things don't change. So sometimes a negative consequence is currently happening or is likely to happen. Okay, where are we up to? Right, so I'll give you a couple of examples to try and embed what I'm saying a bit more, because when we talk about risk, it can be quite hard to comprehend. Well, it's not hard to comprehend, it's just kind of going, well, how do I apply that to reality? So let's have an example of two. So an example of risk of harm in a current situation. So say you're working with a participant who you become aware of that they're in a domestic violence relationship. That relationship not only places their safety at risk, but also creates barriers to that participant being able to access the support that they need to live a healthy life. So the participant has limited ability to understand the impact of the controlling behaviours due to their impairment, which places the participant at significant risk of their health deteriorating because they're not able to get the supports that they need. So a mitigation strategy may include linking the person in with a domestic violence service or a counselling service to help them understanding how that controlling behaviours impact on their ability to access or get linked in with that support. So it might be about the person that they're living with, refusing for services to come into the home. There could be a number of reasons or what's causing those barriers, but it's about supporting that person to get insight or understanding or build their capacity or ability to make those informed decisions themselves, be able to have a voice and to understand that by not getting those supports and services that they need, that it's going to impact on their health. So that could be one situation. Let's have a look at another situation. So, for example, of future risk of harm. So this could involve maybe a participant choosing to have a relationship with people who influence them to hand over their money. So they could be feeling pressured to hand over their money or things like that. So in that situation, say, for example, the person was, spending their money on other people or using their money, and it was leaving them short each week, and therefore they were putting themselves at risk of not being able to have enough funds. So this could be in relation to not being able to pay their bills on time, not being able to pay their rent, which eventually, if that behaviour continued, they could be at risk of becoming homeless. So thinking about what is the risk or what is the future risk if nothing changes, and how can you support that person as part of your safeguarding role when you become aware of this information, how can you support that person to build their capacity or ability to gain more understanding so that they can make informed choices about what they want to do about the situation. So it could be about linking in support, say a psychologist to help the participant understand the consequences it could be cognitive behavior therapy, or it could be around practical reasoning or realistic situations around, so if this happens, then what happens then? So what's the impact of that? So it's really, when we're talking about risk as support coordinators, we're really thinking about when we become aware of this information, what kind of risk is that? How do we assess that? And what kind of strategies can we actually put in place? Okay, hopefully this is making sense for you. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about duty of risk versus duty of care or duty to act. So basically, as a support coordinator, you need to have the skills to be able to understand the differences between these two approaches. So when we talk about dignity of risk and we talk about duty of care or duty to act, depends on what people actually call that. It's reflective of the seriousness of the situation, but it also is reflective of the type of response that's required, the severity or type of response. So let's start with dignity of risk. So dignity of risk is a very strong concept within the NDIS. So it's about saying that all people with disability have right to freedom of choice. A participant has the right to take the reasonable risks and learn from those experiences, just like any other person in our society does. It's about respecting a participant's independence and their preferences and their right to live the life that they choose, even if their choices involve a level of risk and experience some kind of adverse outcome. So it's like any other person within society. The participants that we support, they're going to make choices that often place themselves at risk. It's about having the skills to understand what is the impact, what are the factors that create that risk, and what kind of strategies or safeguards can we put in place. Okay, so as a support coordinator, our role is to take reasonable steps to support a participant to understand how to manage that risk safely with appropriate safeguards in place. So it could be about having a discussion with the participant to help them understand and gain insight into the impact of their choices. It might be about having that conversation about, so these are the things that you want to do. So if you do that, what do you think will happen? How do you think you're going to manage that situation? So having some of those coaching conversations. It could be about linking the participant in with specialist services or therapy services to be able to build that capacity or ability to be able to make those informed decisions. So how a support coordinator evidences this? generally with a duty of risk, it's about understanding what it is, understanding the impact of the barriers, and then documenting how you've addressed those situations within your case notes. So this is a dignity of risk is more when you are assessing risk, it's more about, it's probably a low to medium impact. It's not a serious consequence if the event does happen or has happened. It's more it has little to no impact, and so it's more about saying to the person, well, something could happen. You could be at risk. There could be an adverse outcome. So how do we put safeguards in place to reduce the impact of that risk happening? So duty of care or duty to act. This is often a term that I hear support coordinators when I do a bit of coaching, and often we will talk about a situation and I will say to them, well, can you tell me about why you felt you needed to react in that way? And then they will say to me, well, I've got a duty of care, or I've got a duty that I need to act. And it's kind of, for me, where that terminology comes from. But in reality, duty of care, especially when it comes to risk, it more relates to actions that an organisation and their staff need to take to ensure no harm comes to the participant that they support, that they have a legal or a moral responsibility to protect the safety and well-being of the participant. So this more relates to providing direct care services. So it's kind of like what Brett was talking about earlier. As an organisation, as Endeavour, as an organisation, they have a legal and a moral responsibility to protect the safety of the people that support. So it could be like if they have supported independent living houses, how do they ensure that that person is safe within that environment? So in relation to duty of care or duty of act for a support coordinator, it often indicates a more high-level response. So when a support coordinator becomes aware of a situation that requires a duty of care response, a support coordinator's responsibility is to be able to assess the overall level of risk and develop a risk management plan. So generally when it's a dignity of risk, low impact, it's more about, okay, so let's have a conversation. Let's get some supports. How can we put safeguards in place to ensure that person can actually make those choices and reduce the severity of the risk? Whereas a duty of care or duty of act response is more about, okay, so this is more high level, it's more serious, it's more intense. We need to do a thorough assessment and bring other stakeholders in together to be able to develop a plan to put a safety net or put safeguards around this person. So it's really around the severity and the intensity. Okay. Making sure that I'm keeping up to date. Okay, here we go. Okay, so when we talk about a risk management plan, a risk assessment and risk management plan, it's about, to evidence the factors that contribute to the level of risk and the impact of a risk for a participant. It's also about developing risk management strategies to reduce the likelihood and the impact of the risk occurring and the actions that you will take to manage and monitor that risk. Okay. So how do you actually assess what type of response is required? A dignity of risk or a duty to act or duty of care response? Okay, so it's important when assessing risk to try and determine whether a risk requires either a duty or dignity of risk or a duty of care response. So when you're assessing risk, you're thinking of this as a continuum whose severity starts from the left as in low and progresses to the right as in critical. Yeah? And it's more about the tool that you use to assess this. So it's always important to assess risk in a way to ensure that the response is always a person-centered focused response and is focused on the least intrusive option and has taken into account the participant's right to freedom of choice. Okay. Okay. Generally, when a dignity of risk becomes a duty of care response, It's when as a support coordinator, especially within our training, we teach support coordinators to assess the overall level of risk. This helps us to determine what kind of response is required. So if the risk will likely occur and will have a serious or impact, or an event has already occurred that has a critical impact, then this would normally require a more serious response as an adjudicator key response. So risk assessment, risk management plan, and risk action plan. So risk of harm may include repercussions such as a participant being exposed to the criminal justice system, for example, or being physically harmed by someone in their community. So this could also involve participants experience psychological harm or inflicting harm on others. So the thing about risk is it's very important that support coordinators don't feel that they need to assess and manage risk on their own. A lot of support coordinators that I work with independently. So it's important that you access training or find a mentor, get supervision or coaching to develop the skills to assess and manage risk, because you need to be taking care of your own health and well-being as well. One thing I find with support coordinators is a question we always get is, how do we assess risk and how do we know what actions to take? So what I really talk to support coordinators about is risk subjectivity. So what this means is that when a support coordinator assesses risk, they may perceive or evaluate risk differently than others, as risk is often assessed based on our own experiences, beliefs, and values. So risk subjectivity acknowledges that when what one person might consider a risk might not be perceived as a risk by others. So this is due to each person's varying perspectives and subjective interpretations when assessing risk. So understanding how to mitigate the impact of risk subjectivity is very crucial. So this enables a support coordinator to make informed decisions, to manage risk effectively while minimizing the potential impact of a risk occurring for a participant. So when we talk about managing risk subjectivity, it's the responsibility of each service provider. So if you are an independent or if you and you're wanting to bring on new support coordinators, or you're a support coordination service provider and you've got a number of support coordinators, you must have a comprehensive risk management policy and procedures in place to provide directions to support coordinators around the provider's expectations about how you are required to manage a situation when risk is involved. Okay. So within risk management policies and procedures, these are the kind of things that you need to include. So by putting these things in place, this helps support coordinators and the organisation to come away from that risk subjectivity, to have clarity about what the process is, when they need to act, how they need to act, what are the tools, systems that they've got in place to be able to assess risk. So having definitions and examples of the tolerance levels of risk within an organisation and the actions that a support coordinator is expected to take for each level of risk. So for example, the level of risk a provider is willing to tolerate, and when risk is assessed as low, medium or high. So if a risk is assessed at low, what are the actions that a support coordinator needs to take? If a risk is assessed as critical, how quickly and what actions are supposed to happen. So basically, when we talk about examples, and it was really interesting that Brett mentioned this earlier within his talk, risk is something that we experience on a regular basis, and it's about, when we experience risk, it's about putting strategies in place and learning from those strategies. So a risk management policy and procedures, it's about continuously learning. So in that situation, what did we do? Did it work well? Did it not work well? What could we do differently next time? So really drawing on that experience in those examples and providing those to inform decisions around, and clarity, to provide clarity for support coordinators about the expectations of actions they will take at every level of risk that they've assessed. So the procedures need to provide risk assessment tools that a support coordinator can follow to assess the level of risk, the likelihood of the risk occurring, and the impact of the risk occurs. So basically, it's really about looking at what would be the impact if the risk occurs. So will the risk have little impact or no impact? Will it have a serious impact? And also, what is the likelihood of the risk occurring? So is it likely to occur? It will occur. So really giving the support coordinators a tool, so a clear structure about the expectations, a clear tool to use to be able to guide them through the process. As well as that clear direction and the procedures and the risk assessment tools and processes, it's about providing clear direction of the actions required to manage potential actual risk and their reporting responsibilities. So something that I come across quite often is that support coordinators have come to me and said, yeah, we've got this situation and we've talked through this really complex high risk situation. And I said to them, well, what are your reporting responsibilities? And they said to me, well, what do you mean? And I said, okay, so when this risk happens, who do you need to tell? At what stage do you go and get supervision? Do you contact your team leader? Do you advise management? Do you complete a risk assessment and inform the NDIS? So this is what I'm talking about, is providing really clear clarity around who a support coordinator needs to report to, when and how, and the time frames that they need to take those actions. Procedures also need to be clear about how a support coordinator can monitor and review the effectiveness of risk, and also feedback into these policies and procedures. And that's what I'm talking about, those lessons learned. So a support coordinator's role in responsibility in relation to risk is to understand, know where to find, and how to implement the risk management policies and procedures into their day-to-day role. Okay. You can see lots of comments coming through. I'll keep going, so we've got time to do some questions at the end. Okay. So let's have a look at some strategies to manage risk. So the thing that I find when I'm talking to people about managing risk is that when a crisis situation occurs, we often get very, very pressured as support coordinators to take action, do something. And it's always really, really tempting to step in there and respond to a crisis immediately, to take action straight away. What I talk to support coordinators about all the time, it's imperative that you don't do that. You need to take the time to step back, reflect on, and assess the factors that are contributing to that risk. So what's causing that risk? What are the barriers, and how do those barriers impact on the person with a disability? That really helps you then to prioritise the actions that you can take, and also to really start to think about who else can support me to manage and take responsibility for this risk. This will help you to target your actions more effectively and will help you to facilitate a more of a planned approach to the situation, as opposed to just stepping in and reacting. Taking a planned approach will also help you identify all those other stakeholders. So who else was in that participant support network? Who can help you manage the situation and the risk? So the NDIA refer to managing a crisis situation for support coordinators as crisis planning, prevention, mitigation, and action. What this doesn't mean, which isn't very clear and doesn't really help us understand, okay, so that's what you're saying that's what responsibility is, but it doesn't actually give us the reality of what that actually means. One thing I find from support coordinators all the time, especially when I've done coaching in really high complex situation, is that support coordinators feel that they need to hold on to and manage their ongoing risk all by themselves. And what I want to make really, really clear is that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to understand the strategies that we can use to share, monitor, and manage that risk. So how do you do that? So you develop your skills and ability to assess the level of risk, and then develop the mitigation strategies to reduce the impact or likelihood of the risk occurring, and developing those action plans. So, and then as part of those action plans, so when you're developing mitigation strategies, you might be going, okay, for example, so the risk might be about someone's challenging behaviours and their risk of becoming homelessness. So the factors that are contributing to those barriers could be around the impact of those challenging behaviours. So it could be around a service provider clearly saying, we don't know how to manage these behaviours, but, we're really concerned about harm to our workers. It could be about the participant themselves. So what are those behaviours? Where are those behaviours coming from? How is that creating barriers and risk for that person? So once you understand those factors, it then helps you to understand, well, what are some mitigation strategies that we can put in place to reduce the risk of that person becoming homeless? What are some of the things that we can do? And mitigation strategies are looking at it from a more of a holistic perspective. So what are the safeguards that we need to be putting in place? And then your action plans drill down into, so we have these strategies, how do we put those actions in place, and who's going to take responsibility for those actions? So when you're developing those mitigation strategies, and what we teach people around risk assessments and developing risk management plans, this is when you take it to the stakeholder groups. So often with the dignity of risk, it's really something that you can manage, with this participant directly by linking in supports, having those conversations. Whereas when it's more of a duty of care response, it's more about bringing that stakeholder group together, having those complex case meetings or those stakeholder meetings, and bringing them together and discussing the concerns, discussing the challenges, bringing all that expertise together and identifying who has the skills and experience to develop mitigation strategies. So everyone coming together and saying, well, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm seeing. So how do we come together and share that load? And then developing those actions. So based on people's experience and their skill sets, really saying, okay, so if we've got to have strategies around training those support workers, or researching some other options available, or researching a specific psychology support that needs to be coming into place, who has the skills and experience to do that? And so this is how you develop those action plans to actually share the load, share that level of risk, and identifying who's going to be a responsible owner for that risk. And that's how you develop your risk management action plans. And it's also using those plans to evidence to the NDIS around why changes in supports are required. Okay. I know I talked a lot around risk. Where are we up to? 137. Okay. And so I've talked a lot about skill development and learning how to do that. We've actually just developed some training, we've just launched, been working on for quite a while. It's a professional practice series that delves specifically into this skill development around how to unpack and understand complexity, how to understand the barriers that create complexity and risk, how to develop risk management plans, and then how to report on that. So if you're interested, go and have a look on our website. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go to some questions. Okay. So hopefully,
Mary, I'm just going to drop in quickly, Mary. We've had some technical problems with the Q&A chat this time.
Okay.
But it's always something. But Karen is going to drop the questions in the chat box now. So if you just want to check that, just in the normal chat. Yeah. Okay. She'll pop them in at the bottom so you'll see them. Thanks.
Okay, this is going to be interesting. Okay, so we'll go. I'm just going to go to the top. Okay. Sorry, guys, I'm just going to have to scroll through this. I'm really sorry.
Karen, Karen's going to pop them at the bottom, so you'll have them all at the very bottom of the chat.
So you want me to go straight to the bottom and start from there?
Yeah, just go straight to the bottom, and if that's all right with you, Karen. And she might just be, I think there's a bit of lag as well on this occasion.
Sorry about that, guys.
It's always the way. Very right with you, everybody. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, is there an NDIS template for a risk management plan? No, the NDIS does not have a specific template that they want you to fill in for a risk management plan. As part of our training, we give you templates and a practice framework to be able to identify the complexity, identify the barriers that create risk, and then be able to pull that into a risk assessment, which we use to provide to the NDIS as part of the reporting structure to evidence risk and why additional or different supports are required. It also evidences how you brought the stakeholder group together to actually manage and take responsibility for that risk. So one of the major things that we find in relation to risk management plans and reporting is that people don't provide enough evidence about how they're managing that situation. So what have you done? You're asked for these supports, but what are you doing to manage the situation? And that's part of the training that we've got to actually show you how to do all that. Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay. Could this include a chance of coercive control or for a partner to speak over and for the participant? Yeah, domestic violence. I think you're talking about domestic violence. Domestic violence comes into a number of range of ways. I suppose what I was trying to highlight with that example is that it's not our role as a support coordinator to step in and go, okay, so that's domestic violence. Let's talk about domestic violence. That's not our role. Our role is to understand what are the barriers that a participant that we are supporting is experiencing and how do we support them to build their capacity or ability to get information, to understand how those barriers create risk for themselves or create risk to them not accessing or being able to get support that they need. So what are the supports? What are the strategies that we can put in place? If you are concerned that someone is in a domestic violence relationship, linking them in with a domestic violence service or linking them into counselling support or talking to the psychologist if they have a psychologist that's working with them that can give them have some conversations around that. So it's really about thinking about your role as a support coordinator and how can you put safeguards in place. Have access to IDL funding for support coordinating. Okay, I'm not quite sure what that one is. Okay. 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 What do you do when your risk assessment thoughts on duty of care are different from another service who is also providing care to the same client? Really good question. I suppose the situation that I've come across is that I have been working with a client, for example, and they are in a supported independent living service, and there was a situation where the person put herself at risk. And I talked to the SIL provider around that, and the SIL provider said, well, that's their choice. They have a choice to go out. They have a choice to make those decisions. And I suppose what I had said to the provider is, as I said to them, well, the consequence of those decisions actually being made was a risk for that person. It was a detrimental risk. And so I talked to them about saying, well, where is your risk assessments? Where are your policies and procedures around supporting a person to around supervision or around knowing where they're going or ensuring that that person is safe when they go out into the community. So I suppose, and what I would say, I'd need to know the situation, but what I would say there is really talking to the organisation, depending on if you're a support coordinator and you've become aware of a situation, talking to that organisation about how did you manage that situation? Have you completed any risk assessments? How do you manage risk in relation to the participants that you're supporting? Getting copies of those risk assessments, or what are they, talking to them about their duty of care in relation to, and also the code of conduct and their responsibility in relation completing incident reports. Did you do an incident report? Can I have a copy of that report? So this is where stakeholder groups are really, really good, when you bring in providers so that you're not really, if you're finding that you're talking to a provider in isolation and you're not getting anywhere, bring in the whole stakeholder group together. So ask for a stakeholder meeting where everybody comes in together, and then really having a conversation around your concerns, and then getting perspectives from other providers as well around, okay, so I see that differently, or well, how did that work, or how can we put strategies in place? So really having a thinking about the safeguarding role as a support coordinator. Doesn't have a risk assessment template. Okay. Okay, if participants do not follow clinical recommendations and this puts their life at risk in their own home, what obligations do we have as a support coordinator to show what we have done or could have done if they passed away? Wow, that's very serious. I suppose it's part of a process. So if you are working with a participant, and I don't know this situation, but if you're working with a participant, and say, for example, the participant, you've linked them in with a clinician who has done an assessment and has given them recommendations about how to manage that condition, or putting strategies in place to ensure that they're safe, that their health doesn't deteriorate. And if they've chosen not to follow those recommendations, that would also be something that I'm assuming the clinician would be monitoring. I would assume that they would be monitoring and would be reporting on, and if they're monitoring it and then that person's not following their directions, that they would be documenting that as well. Also, from a support coordinator perspective, it would also be about you could be doing a risk assessment to highlight the fact that you have linked in this provider, that the clinician has provided recommendations, the participant has chosen not to follow those recommendations. So as part of that risk assessment, you could be providing that to the NDIS. But it's really about what documentation do you need to have to evidence that you've taken action, you've put strategies in place, you've put safeguards in place, and the participant has still chosen not to continue to put themselves at risk. I'm hoping that will help. Sorry, it's hard to answer these questions when you don't really have really good context. Case notes, behaviour support plans, well done. Thank you, Melissa, for answering that. CH, yep. So your case notes, your risk management plans, putting behaviour support plans in place. And if there's behaviour supports in place, then the clinician should be monitoring that and following up around the recommendations. Okay. Okay. If you have really high risk, then you should be doing risk assessments and risk management plans. Often when there is high risk and really high levels of complexity, it's often an indicator that the supports that the participant is actually accessing at that point in time are often not meeting their current needs, or their needs have changed and they need different supports. So a risk assessment is a really good tool to evidence the barriers and how they create risk, how the participant supports needs have changed, and it also provides evidence about why different supports or more supports are actually required. Okay, hopefully that helps. Yep. Okay. Okay. There's a big difference between an organisational's risk profile management versus register per individual. Yep. Definitely. There's a huge difference between organisational risk and support coordinators directly working with the participants. So from what I've talked about today is really in relation to our role in supporting participants. It's part of our safeguarding role. So how do we manage and evidence the support that we've provided? How do we evidence the actions that we've taken, that we put safeguards in place? Okay. What if community nurses even cease services due to them not following their recommendations and puts the RN at risk? Okay, sorry, Melissa, I don't really. Again, that is the person's choice. The natural consequence will flow on from that. Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I've also worked with support coordinators who have said to me, I'm working with a participant, they have a psychosocial disability, for example. I have worked with them, I've understood what the barriers is, I've put safeguards in place, the person continues to put themselves at risk. And I suppose what I've talked to that person about is, so talk to me about the strategies you put in place. So they put strategies in place to minimize, to help the person build their capacity, their awareness, their insight, their ability to understand the impact of their choices. They are still choosing to make those choices. They're still choosing to go down that path. So there's only so much that a support coordinator could do. So it's about us really understanding, how do we evidence that? How do we evidence the action that we've taken? How do we ensure that we've put safeguards in place? And so it's about, how do we do our risk assessments? How do we do our risk management plans? Who do we need to provide that to? It's informing the NDIS. A person, whether they have a disability or not, has a right to make their own choices. Our role is about, what are the actions that we're going to take to be able to ensure that those choices are safe and how they make those choices. How can we put safeguards in place? If a person chooses to ignore that advice, then it is like any other choice that we make as well. There are consequences that flow on from that. Okay, hopefully I'm making sense. Okay. Okay. Here are the questions from the chat box. Thank you, Karen. I've just found them. We've got 10 minutes. Coercive control. Yep, definitely. Risk assessments. Okay, I think I've got most of them. Risk template. Okay. Follow conditions. I think I've kind of got them. Okay. Internal, external supervision have been very useful. Look, we do a lot of coaching and it's like supervision, I suppose, around complex case conferences for support coordinators, especially independent support coordinators. So if you're an independent, really looking for that internal, external supervision. Okay. Yep, definitely. Hi, James. Yeah, okay. How is the best way we interface with mainstream service in schools, perhaps to mitigate risk? Really, really good point. So when I'm talking about the stakeholders, I often talk about, or I use the language of the supports network, or who are connected to that person. Another language is that they often say stakeholder group. So stakeholders for me aren't just paid service providers. Stakeholders, so if you're working with children, it's who is connected to that child. So it's within the school environment, it's within when the person's at home. So who is connected to that child, or who's connected to that adult? You know, is the child have an education and they're having trouble at school around their behaviours within the school? So can you bring the school into those stakeholder meetings and have conversations? And so it's really about navigating that interface. So what are the responsibility of the school in supporting that person within that educational environment? And as a support coordinator, how can we support that person to increase their capacity to manage those behaviours in the school environment, but also outside the school environment? So how can you work together around that? Okay, definitely. Okay, hope I've got support short 7. Okay. I've been asked on multiple occasions if the COS is also assessing the risk for the support worker and the provider. I think I know what you mean. I've advised the independent support worker and provider should be doing their own risk assessments. Therefore, the COS is doing the assessment only for the participant. Yep, absolutely, that's correct. It is a support coordinator's, it's a support worker's responsibility to have the skills and ability to be able to assess risk. So if they are working with a participant and they are going to transport someone, they need to be assessing, well, what's the risk around that? What are the strategies we need to use? What are the systems and structures that we need to be putting in place? Absolutely, as well as a provider. So the SIL providers should be doing their own risk assessments. Any provider that is working with the participant directly. Our role is in relation to the participant. So from our perspective and part of that safeguarding role, we would be going, when you're working with a participant, we would be doing that front end work. So what is that? So if you were wanting to engage a support worker to take you out on community access, so what are the skills and experience that you want from that support coordinator? That support worker. How are you going to access the community? Do we need to think about what kind of transport you're going to need? Do we need to think about when you're out in the community, what are the things that you're going to need to do? What kind of support you're going to need? So we do that front end planning. We get down to the logistics around what that support needs to look like. And then when we do our research, we do our research around the criteria that that person needs for that support to be safe. So that's kind of leading into that whole process around safeguarding. And then once that support's in place, we're monitoring that support. So there we'll be talking about supporting the participant to set up a service agreement. So what needs to go into that service agreement? What is it to ensure that that participant's going to be safe when that support worker's taking them out on that community access? That helps us then have a base of things to come back to. But also once that support's in place, we're then talking to the participant, how's that support going? Do you have any concerns? Reviewing that support. So you're absolutely right. Our risk assessments are in relation to our relationship with the participant and the barriers that they may be experiencing and accessing the support that they need. Okay. Well done. Okay. Okay. Now that the plans are changing, have stated support and is not very flexible. Okay. How the funding is changing shouldn't really have much issue. Can you please email me, Melissa? That would be really good because I need to understand that one a bit better. Exactly. So our role is to link participants not only to funded supports, but also mainstream community. It's about building a resilient network around that person so that the supports are more sustainable. NDIS funding is around understanding that people with disability with complex support needs have unique needs that can't necessarily be met within society. So the funding is about what is their unique support needs and how do we create those support needs by purchasing individualized supports that meet those needs, and then how do we wrap around all those other services to actually build that resilient and sustainable network. Okay. 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 Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we're getting to like 4 minutes. I think I need to go. If you have any other questions, I'm welcome for you to email me at info@scacademy.com.au. As well, Vicky's going to collect some questions so that I can respond to those. So, Vicky, I will stop talking and I'll let you go.
Thanks so much, Mary. I don't know how you managed to pack all that in. Literally so many questions coming through from everybody. Thank you so much. That was quite an engaging little topic there. So I just want to say thanks again to Mary. I'm sure many people today in this webinar have learned some new information and strategies about today's topic. So thanks for everybody's input there. I'm just going to move on to now. It's time to announce the winner of the Lucky Door Prize. So we've just pulled out the name and it is Leanne Baxter. So Leanne, I'll be sending you an email today with details on how to redeem your free coaching session with Support Coordination Academy. Tomorrow you will all receive an email including a recording of today's session, along with a transcript and a link to the survey. Again, we always appreciate having your feedback as it really helps us to continue delivering insightful future webinars. So please keep an eye out for that in your inboxes. And lastly, we would love to invite everyone here today to come along to our October webinar. The next webinar topic will cover demystifying the NDIS navigator recommendations, which I believe is going to be a hot topic. It will be held on Wednesday, the 16th of October at the same time of 12 till 1 AEST. So we hope to see you all there. And for those who missed it earlier, we have just posted the subscription link into the comments for those who want to enhance their support efforts and stay informed with our bi-weekly Care Connect newsletter. A lot of work goes into that just so that you guys get specific information. On behalf of Endeavour Foundation, I want to extend a warm thank you for attending today's webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Hello everybody, welcome to our Learning and Lifestyle Hub. This is where we make learning fun.
Hi, my name is Andy. I love making Mitigation. One day, I'm going on MasterChef.
Hi, I'm Grace. I live independently with support when I need it. I live my life my way.
Hi, Kevin. I live here. I like to go to the gym.
Hi, I'm Tricia. I love my life. I got the garbage shop. The high, the good.
I'm Clayton and I love rugby league. I'm normally kicking the footy around in my backyard. This is my home. This is my life. This is my community.
Hi, my name's Jeremy. My daughter's 3 years old. My daughter's proud that I come to work.
I like that they're going to work.
Hi, I'm Maddie and I work for the Endeavour Foundation. I come to work with a big smile on my face every day.
Love to work here because that's my new family.